This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Well, that episode of Eyes on the Prize about the freedom rides, I think, talks about a really important period of the freedom struggle. And the freedom ride brought together all the basic elements that would really dominate the struggle for the next 5 years or so. If you think about it, these are people who had been involved in the sit-ins throughout the South, and now they take that effort, which is mostly concentrated in the Upper South, where they faced arrest, but not a huge amount of violence. And now they're taking it into Alabama, Birmingham, Montgomery, where Martin Luther King had and the Montgomery bus boycott had happened. Birmingham, where the person on the ground is Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth will emerge as the leading force in the Birmingham campaign of 1963. You begin to bring the leaders of the sit-ins all together to keep this campaign, to keep the freedom rides going into Mississippi. So you really have the most dedicated, the most determined of the sit-in leaders all congregating together and all being brought together in jail cells in Mississippi and spending the rest of the summer there. And like in many freedom struggles, the imprisonment experience serves a very useful purpose for the movement. I mean, it's not the best way of spending the summer probably, but nonetheless, it brings together people who otherwise would not have spent very much time together. A Fred Leonard and a Stokely Carmichael, a John Lewis from Nashville, people from Atlanta, all of them coming together and being able to share stories about their movements, share ideas. You have the more religious focused people from Nashville. They're coming in with their emphasis on Gandhian nonviolence, taught to them by James Lawson. The people from Howard University, much more secular, people like Stokely Carmichael, with some experience in leftist political movements in the North. One thing you don't have are a lot of students from Mississippi and Alabama. But the fact that the movement kind of comes to them stimulates their activism, because they begin to ask, well, why don't we have sit-ins here? There hadn't been sit-ins. There's not a lot of lunch counters in the small towns of Mississippi, but even in Jackson there hadn't been sit-ins. The sit-ins that took place in Montgomery, in Alabama, had been treated much more harshly, students being expelled and other longer sentences. So all of this kind of converges on the Deep South, what is called the Black Belt. It's also in this area that you have the greatest potential for a mass-based social movement. Because in the Black Belt you have, in many counties, a black majority. So you begin to see the need to take this movement into the areas where most black people in the South are living. Now it turns out that during this campaign, another person enters the struggle who was going to play a very important role, and that's Bob Moses. Bob Moses had become involved during the 1950s, mainly through the efforts of Bayard Rustin. As you recall from my lecture about Rustin and about Ella Baker, they had brought together a support group in New York to help the Southern struggle. They had established an office called In Friendship, and Bob Moses as a school teacher, had come to volunteer his time. From his memory of that time, it was basically stuffing packets of mail, helping with fundraising events, just doing whatever he could as a math teacher at Horace Mann School. Bob Moses, in terms of his background, had studied at Harvard, got his master's degree, and had started teaching school, and also had developed a certain attitudes about social struggle. He had been influenced by the Quaker movement, the Quaker peace movement, and had actually taken part in youth camps during the summers where he learned more about their philosophy. In college, he had studied existentialist philosophy, read the works of Camus. Existentialism served as one of the bases for his the attitudes he later developed, particularly Camus, who, as a French philosopher, had kind of been between Jean-Paul Sartre, who had moved toward the Communist Party during the 40s and 50s, and Camus, who was always skeptical about all organized kind of centralized political movements, but was a radical in his own right. I mean, he had taken part in the French Resistance, and he had offered kind of a middle course between accepting the existing order and being maybe a liberal or reformer within that order, or trying to start a revolution to overturn that order. So for Camus, the role of the radical, the rebel, was to take on the existing order, but not to create what he thought were the conditions of oppression that might replace that order. That is, not to accept any kind of hierarchical movement to bring about a revolution. And so this was Moses' background when he started getting involved in the 50s, supporting what became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So when Rustin suggested that during the summer of 1960 that Bob Moses go to the South and help out Ella Baker, who had taken over the headquarters of the SCLC, Bob Moses accepted that assignment and came to Atlanta during the summer of 60. It turns out that many of the students thought that he was a communist. Why? Because he was this northern black who had come to the South. He was articulate. He seemed to know a lot about politics. So there was this rumor going around that this communist had come down to help the movement. And actually that led to his first meeting with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King heard these rumors and had called him into his office, and the two of them kind of had this encounter. And the way Bob Moses remembered it when I interviewed him was that neither of them really understood each other. You know, by that time, Bob Moses had really been influenced strongly by Ella Baker, and had kind of adopted many of Ella Baker's ideas about King, that King was too cautious, that he was not, that people were becoming too dependent on King's leadership. He felt that Ella Baker's idea of a grassroots struggle was much better. And by this time, this is the summer of 1960, SNCC is actually meeting, or at least has their own headquarters, in a corner of the SCLC office. And Ella Baker is being pushed out of SCLC, and she's becoming much closer to the young students in SNCC and beginning to advise them. So it's in this context that Ella Baker says to Bob Moses as the summer goes on, why don't you go on this field trip to Mississippi? Why don't you find out what's going on there? We haven't gotten very much support for for SNCC. None of the students in Alabama and Mississippi seem to be very active. So why don't you go to Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and try to attract people to come to the October conference of SNCC. And this was the first time that Bob Moses had been in these areas, and he meets up with an NAACP leader by the name of Amzie Moore. And Amzie Moore was working in the Delta of Mississippi, an area that had a black majority. And Amzie Moore talks with Bob Moses and convinces him that, well, there are different conditions really here in Mississippi. It's not about sitting in to integrate lunch counters. It's about registering people to vote. If we can register people to vote, we can take over these counties because we have the majority. It's just that black people are not able to vote. And he gets a promise from Bob Moses that the following summer, after he finishes up his teaching in New York, that he will come to Mississippi and help Amzie Moore set up a voter registration school and start training people to go down to the voter registration office and take the voter registration test. Now, during that time, there's this article that appears in Jet magazine about Bob Moses' plan to go to Mississippi, and a man in Macomb, Mississippi reads that. C.C. Bryant, E.W. Steptoe, two of the people who were leaders of the NAACP in southwest Mississippi. And when Bob Moses returns, he finds that the conditions are really not set up for him in the Delta. You know, there's no place where they can go to set up this registration school. And C.C. Bryant, who was the local head of the NAACP in Macomb, invites him to come there instead. And that's where Bob Moses shows up at the beginning of August 1961. Now if you put these two things together, the freedom rides, here you have the students coming to Mississippi, they're kind of bringing the movement in, they're staying in Parchman Penitentiary during that summer, and at the same time Bob Moses is going to Mississippi to set up this voter registration school. And there's also this division that takes place, which I write about in the SNCC book, within SNCC, between the people who are in favor of protesting for desegregation, kind of led by Diane Nash and Marion Barry and others, and those who were in favor of voter registration. And Ella Baker works out this compromise where they set up two wings. They each can do what they want. Those who want to do voter registration can do that. Those who want to continue the sit-ins and other kinds of protests for desegregation can do that. So all of this is happening, and at the same time, some money arrives in the form of a foundation grant to support voter registration. So at that point, SNCC is able to hire its first staff members, and Bob Moses becomes one of the, I think, the first staff member of SNCC. And Macomb becomes the center, southwest Mississippi becomes the center of a new struggle. Several of the students who get out of jail at the end of the summer decide that rather than going back to school, they're going to become SNCC workers, SNCC field secretaries. Since Bob Moses is already in southwest Mississippi, that becomes the new center. That along with Albany, Georgia, where some of them also go to establish an office. Now at that point, Bob Moses had just begun to make some breakthroughs in southwest Mississippi. And fortunately, we have kind of almost a diary of his activities once he arrived in Macomb. And just a little bit of the flavor of that the kinds of things that you would face if you were a civil rights worker trying to convince people to go to the county seat. Registering to vote was very difficult in Mississippi. Not only once you got there, you had to take this test to interpret some section of the Constitution of the state of Mississippi, and then you had to fill out a section where you describe the obligations of a citizen. So what he did is began to set up classes where he would train people on how to take this test, and then he would accompany them to the county seat. You had to go to the county courthouse in order to register to vote. You had to wait until the time when it was open. And I don't know how many of you have ever been to any of these rural areas of Mississippi or Alabama. Yeah, you have. It is even today. It's kind of an interesting experience because there's usually a square and people kind of hang out there because these are basically rural communities. So there's going to be, mainly older people who kind of hang out around the county square. And everybody notices everyone else's business. I went there later. I remember going to Lowndes County, and just to kind of give you, this was in the early 70s, but it wasn't really that different. I remember driving up because I wanted to do an interview with the person who had become the sheriff of Lowndes County, a black guy who had been elected. And so I drive up, and every eye in the square is on me. I mean, it's like, first of all, I had California license plates, what I should have changed before getting there. But by the time I got in, did the interview, came back, and then I drove to some of the rural areas to interview Bob Mance, who was one of the SNCC workers who was still living there. By the time I got to his house, people were saying, "Oh, you're the one who drove up earlier today at the county courthouse." The word had already passed, 10 miles out into the county that some new person was in town. And it was that kind of a situation where Bob Moses would come in. And this is a description of what it was like. I accompanied about 3 people down to Liberty in Ammett County to begin our first registration attempt there. One was a very old man, and then 2 ladies, middle-aged. We left early morning on August 15th. It was a Tuesday. We arrived at the courthouse about 10 o'clock. The registrar came out. I waited by the side for the man or one of the ladies to say something to the registrar. He asked them what did they want, what were they here for, in a very rough tone of voice. They didn't say anything. They were literally paralyzed with fear. So after a while, I spoke up and said that they would like to come to register to vote. So he asked, "Well, who are you? What have you got to do with it? Are you here to register?" So I told him who I was and that we were conducting a school in Macomb and that these people had attended the school and they wanted the opportunity to register. Well, he said I'd have to wait because there was someone there filling out the form. And then he goes on, our people started to register. In the meanwhile, a procession of people began moving in and out of the registration office. The sheriff, a couple of his deputies, people from the tax office, people who do the driver's license, looking in, staring, moving back out, muttering. A highway patrolman finally came in and sat down in the office. And we stayed that way in sort of uneasy tension all morning. The first person to fill out the form took a long time to do it, and it was noontime before we were finished. On the way home, we were followed down the highway by a patrolman who had spent the day in the registrar's office, Officer Carlisle. He tailed us for about 10 miles, all the way back toward Macomb. At one point, we pulled off, and he passed us, circled around, and we pulled off, and he passed us in the opposite direction. Then he turned around again and followed us again. Then he flagged us down, and I got out of the car to ask him what was the trouble, because the people in the car were very, very frightened. He asked me who I was, what my business, and told me that I was interfering in what he was doing. I said I simply wanted to find out what the problem was and what we were stopped for. He told me to get back in the car. As I did so, he jotted my name down. "Get in the car, nigger," slamming the door after me. Then he told us to follow him and took us to Macomb, where I was told that I was placed under arrest. By the way, he later calls from the Justice Department. He had been given the number of John Doerr, the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil rights, and that gets him basically released. We had a trial after that. I was found guilty on this charge of interfering with an officer, and the county prosecutor went out, consulted, and came back, and I was given a suspended sentence, 90 days suspended sentence, and fined $5. I refused to pay the $5 court costs. I was taken to jail then. This was my first introduction to Mississippi jails. I spent a couple of days in jail and was finally bailed out. Now, later on, the violence began, and some of this I covered in the book. He was beaten very severely by Billy Jack Caston, who was one of those who had been watching this registration attempt. I remember very sharply that I didn't want to go immediately back to Macomb after being beaten, because my shirt was very bloody, and I figured if we went back in, we would probably be fighting everybody. So instead, we went back to Steptoes, where we washed down before we came back to Macomb. By the way, one of the things he says he was concerned about was that if people saw him with his bloody shirt, that would basically discourage them from ever going to register to vote. All of this kind of culminates in several incidents where two other SNCC workers are beaten up very severely, and this leads to an effort on the part of the young people in Macomb to start their own movement. They start a sit-in movement. They feel that the Freedom Riders have come, and now it's time for these young teenagers to start their own movement, start protesting against segregation. This was against what the NAACP leaders want, because they had brought Bob Moses and SNCC in to help their voter registration campaign. But nonetheless, Brenda Travis, a 16-year-old girl in the high school, was arrested for leading a sit-in. She was thrown in jail and expelled from school. And this leads to a division within the black community, because they didn't want the young people involved in the sit-in campaign. They were frightened for them. They felt that they were facing enormous potential for violence in Mississippi. And then finally, on September 31st, 1961, Herbert Lee is killed. Herbert Lee had been one of the people working with Bob Moses and the workers. He's not only killed, but he's killed by E.H. Hurst, who happened to be a Mississippi state representative, that is, a politician. And he's killed in broad daylight, in front of about 12 witnesses. Before the day is done, he's absolved by a coroner's jury who argue that he had been threatened by Herbert Lee. Now, it turns out that several of the black witnesses to the killing of Lee wanted to come forward. They were frightened to do that. Bob Moses spends much of early October searching for these people, trying to get them to tell their stories to him. They finally agree to tell basically what happened. And they said that the story was basically this. They were standing at the cotton gin early in the morning, and they saw Herbert Lee drive up in his truck with a load of cotton. E.H. Hurst followed him in an empty truck. Hurst got out of his truck, came to the cab on the driver's seat of Lee's truck, and began arguing with Lee. He began gesticulating toward Lee and pulled out a gun which he had under his shirt and began threatening Lee with it. One of the people that was close by said that Hearst was telling Lee, "I'm not fooling around this time, I really mean business," and that Lee told him, "Put the gun down, I won't talk to you unless you put the gun down." Hearst put the gun back under his coat, and then Lee slid out from the other side on the off side of the cab. As he got out, Hearst ran around the front of the cab, took his gun out again, pointed it at Lee, and shot him. This was the story that 3 Negro witnesses told us on 3 separate nights as we went out, tracking them down, knocking on doors, waking them up in the middle of the night. They also told us another story. 2 of them admitted that they had been pressured by the local authorities, the sheriffs, the deputy sheriffs, and some of the white people in town, that there had been a fight, to say that there had been a fight, that Lee had had a tire tool and that he tried to hit Hearst with a tire tool, and that Hearst had shot Lee in self-defense. They said this story was not true, but they had been forced to tell it for fear of their own lives. Lee, in any case, was a small man, about 5'4", weighing about 150 pounds. Hearst was a large man, about 6'2", upwards of 200 pounds. It is inconceivable that he could have been so threatened by Lee that he would have had to shoot him. Well, once Lee is shot, a lot of the voter registration work just simply came to an end. It turned out that one of the people who had changed his story was later attacked. His jaw was broken by the deputy sheriff, who knew that he had told the FBI. The FBI had come back and reported to the local sheriff that one of the witnesses had changed his story. Now this leads then to the incident in Macomb, where the young high school students lead a march. They want to march to the courthouse to protest against the expulsion of the students for the first sit-ins. And this leads to a decision among the SNCC workers. And it's a crucial decision that has a lot of bad consequences for their work. They have to decide, when the students come into the SNCC office and begin drawing up posters and other things and saying that they're going to march to the county courthouse, which is 5 miles away, the SNCC workers have to decide what they're going to do. They don't want to participate in this. They know that this is perhaps going to be ill-fated, but they decide that they can't refuse to participate because the students are going to do it anyway. And they end up taking part in this aborted march, which never gets out of Macomb. They're attacked by a mob. The students are arrested, expelled from school. The SNCC workers are thrown in jail. Among the charges are contributing to delinquency of minors, which ends up a very serious charge. And they have to shut down their voting rights activity. Well, the Macomb campaign and the campaign that's going on at the same time in Albany, Georgia, can be seen as 2 failed campaigns. That is, they don't succeed in registering very many people, in fact, hardly any. They face an enormous amount of violence, but they do succeed in bringing together the core of the staff that is going to take the voting rights campaign into the Black Belt. In both Macomb and later, after they leave Macomb, go to Jackson, Bob Moses begins to bring together the basis of his staff, all recruited from Mississippi. In Albany, Georgia, Charles Sherrod begins to bring together his staff, some of them recruited from Albany, Georgia, others from outside the South, basically religious, motivated people who come and want to participate. And these 2 centers, Southwest Georgia, the Delta of Mississippi, become the crucial places where the next stage of the movement takes place. It's there that you begin to see a full-time staff field organizers begin to develop the tactics that begin to show some success, that is, working with local leaders, people who have been usually involved with the NAACP since the 1950s, trying to get these people to support them by taking them into their homes, by getting local young people active in the movement. And this effort, I think, is really what the struggle of the 1960s was centered around. For the rest of the decade, the people who come and begin to work full-time in these communities, this is something that is new in the civil rights movement. The NAACP had no equivalent of it. SCLC has no equivalent of it. The idea of organizers moving into communities and making a commitment to stay for a long time was something new and different, and it had, I think, a lot of permanent consequences. One of the consequences is that many of these people are still there. If you go to Mississippi and Alabama, especially the smaller communities, people like Bob Mance are still living there. Charles Sherrod is still living there. Some of them have now moved into political positions, county offices, as they've succeeded in registering the black vote. Most of them are strong believers in kind of the Bob Moses approach to organizing. This approach, which I think I said in the previous lecture, is very much influenced by Ella Baker and the notion of working yourself out of a job, trying to find local leaders to carry on the struggle, seeing yourself as a catalyst rather than a leader. All of these approaches, I think, were refined and developed in the rural areas of Mississippi and Alabama. A little bit about Bob Moses and what happens to him. He stays in Mississippi. In 1962, the various civil rights organizations in Mississippi get together and form an organization called the Congress of Federated Organizations, COFO. COFO became the way in which the NAACP, CORE, SCLC, which really doesn't have very much impact there, and SNCC cooperate and becomes the channel through which money to support voter registration arrives in Mississippi. Bob Moses becomes the director of COFO's voter registration effort, and SNCC really provides the bulk of the organizers on COFO's staff. Now, I wanted to show another segment of Eyes on the Prize that deals with the subsequent development of the movement in Mississippi. And this culminates, and we won't get there today, this culminates with the founding of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and the challenge to the main regular Democratic Party at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. This is the crucial event of the Southern struggle because it's the point at which the proponents of voter registration place their case before the liberal forces in the Democratic Party, and they basically say, you have a choice to make. You can either support the regular Democrats, which is an all-white political party, or you can support the Freedom Democratic Party, which we've established and it's open to anyone who wants to join, but it's not the official party. of the state of Mississippi. And by placing that choice before the national administration, before Lyndon Johnson, they forced Johnson to take a stand. Then who knows what happens at that? You've done your readings, right? Yes.
Like he decides that he tries to make a compromise that they get 2 at-large seats.
Okay. Yeah, he offers these 2 at-large seats at the Democratic convention. What does the Freedom Democrats say to that?
They're like, we don't want those 2 seats.
Yeah, I mean, they reject the compromise. This becomes kind of the crucial decision, because from that point on, you begin to see a real division. Bob Moses moves from Mississippi to Alabama. Stokely Carmichael goes to Lowndes County in Alabama. There they form the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which becomes the Black Panther Party. And that is the first political party independent of the Democrats, and it represents a new thrust in black politics. And it's basically saying, yes, we have mobilized these people in the Black Belt of Mississippi, we've brought them into the political process, but we don't want to bring them in simply as part of an untransformed Democratic Party. We want to build a new and different kind of political force. Bob Moses himself, by that time, gets drafted and has to decide what to do. He decides to leave the country, first to Canada for a while, then he decides to go to Tanzania, leaves the United States, or at least for Tanzania in the late 60s, stays there, actually raises his family there through the mid-1960s and returns in the late 60s to the United States. So he kind of takes himself out of the freedom struggle, in part for reasons of the draft, but I think in part also because of the philosophy. If your job is to work yourself out of a job, one of the things that he thought was bad about the outcome of the Mississippi struggle is that people became dependent on it. And the only way he could figure to get out of that dependence was to take himself out of the Mississippi movement and allow the people that he had worked with to assert themselves as independent leaders. Let me show you a bit of the Mississippi part of this. Unfortunately, are there any questions while I'm setting us up? Because it always takes a little bit of time to get through the menu.
Yeah. After the freedom riders were jailed in Carson Penitentiary, what was the interstate? Was there like interstate contact or something that came out of that? Was there victory?
Yeah, it goes back actually to the 1940s when there had been Irene Morgan had pushed the issue of, can there be segregation in interstate commerce? You know, the idea was that under state law, under the Plessy decision, it had been possible to have segregated facilities as long as they were equal. But if you're going in interstate commerce, the argument was that that should be a federal jurisdiction. If you're traveling between states, you shouldn't be bound by the segregation laws of a particular state. So there had been a Supreme Court decision in favor of desegregation, but it had never been enforced. So then we jump ahead to the freedom rides. Well, they want to see that decision enforced. But it takes a federal agency to enforce it. And the Kennedy administration was not enforcing it. They went finally to the Interstate Commerce Commission and said, we want a ruling enforcing this decision. But that ruling doesn't come until October of 1961, after most of the freedom rides are over. After that, then it was still a question of how do you actually enforce this on the ground? And part of that happens in places like Albany, where people the freedom ride idea continues well into the 62, 63, really until 1964, the Civil Rights Act, where students from Howard and other places would find segregated restaurants and would go there in order to test these facilities. And this kept going on, I think, well into 64. I think some of you already know the class on Thursday will be in Wallenberg, and it'll be a guest lecture by Vincent Harding, who is was a colleague of Martin Luther King. Is going to be talking about his relationship, his reflections on Martin Luther King, and particularly the Riverside Church speech, anti-war speech that King gave in April of 1967. Vincent Harding, as well as Clarence Jones, were among those who helped King write that speech. So you're welcome to invite other people to come. That's why we're opening it up to other CSRE classes. And there will be a luncheon afterwards up here on the 3rd floor. So you can get your lunch and also have a time to talk with him more personally. One thing I wanted to mention about Bob Moses, anyone know what he's doing now? I know you know. He's running the Algebra Project. Anyone heard of that? It's a nationwide project to bring math education to middle school kids. And the reason why he's involved with this is he thinks of this as the civil rights movement of the 21st century. He thinks that access to good education, especially good technological education, is essential for getting ahead in the 21st century. And he's been focusing on high schools, predominantly black and Latino high schools, where in many cases they do not offer algebra at the same time that you would in other schools, predominantly white schools, and therefore students get behind in the sequence, and when they get to high school they cannot get on the college track. So he sees this as the crucial intervention, and he equates this to voter registration in the 60s. So that's what he's doing, is organizing with today. There's several schools that are affiliated with the Algebra Project in the Bay Area, one in San Francisco, one in Oakland. And any of you who wanted to get involved in that might check out their website and find out more information. See you on Thursday.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.